The apartment had become a fortress of quiet. Margaret stood at her kitchen counter on a Thursday evening, watching steam rise from her microwaved dinner, and realised she couldn't remember the last time she'd spoken out loud. Not at work, where emails had replaced most conversations. Not at home, where she lived alone. Not even to herself. She was 47 years old, and she had engineered her own isolation with surgical precision. It hadn't started dramatically. There was no falling out, no burned bridge she could point to and say, "That's when everything changed." Instead, it had been gradual, like a tide going out so slowly, you don't notice until you're standing on dry sand, the water just a distant line on the horizon. First, she'd stopped answering Karen's calls. Karen from book club, who could turn any conversation into a breathless monologue about her daughter's divorce, her son's gambling problem, her sister's thyroid condition. Margaret had listened for years, offering sympathy and advice that was never taken, watching Karen's life spiral in the same patterns while her own stress levels climbed with each phone call. Then came the family dinners. Her sister Rachel hosted them monthly, gatherings that should have been warm and connecting but instead felt like emotional minefields. Rachel and their brother Tom would spend hours dissecting their mother's health complaints, their cousin's financial disasters, the neighbour's affair. Margaret would sit there, tension building in her shoulders, wondering why every conversation had to be about someone else's chaos. "You're so quiet lately," Rachel had said at the last dinner Margaret attended 3 months ago. "Just tired," Margaret had replied, pushing peas around her plate. "You work too hard. You need to make time for what matters, for us." But that was the problem, wasn't it? When she was with them, she felt like a dumping ground for everyone's anxieties. When she was alone, she felt nothing. And nothing had seemed preferable to drowning in other people's problems. So she'd pulled back, declined invitations, let calls go to voicemail, created distance. The silence had been a relief at first. No more listening to Karen's litany of disasters. No more family dinners that left her exhausted and tense. No more coworkers stopping by her desk to complain about their workload, their marriages, their teenagers. She could breathe. But somewhere along the way, the relief had curdled into something else. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was thick, oppressive, like living inside a snow globe where everything was frozen and nothing moved. Margaret carried her dinner to the couch and turned on the television, but the voices from the screen felt hollow, one-dimensional. She scrolled through her phone. 43 unread messages in the family chat. 17 missed calls from Karen over the past month. A text from her colleague, Sarah. "Miss seeing you at lunch. Everything okay?" She set the phone face down without responding. The food was tasteless. She couldn't remember what she'd chosen, had simply grabbed something from the freezer out of habit. She'd been eating the same rotation of frozen meals for weeks now, maybe months. Time had started to feel slippery, days blending into each other without distinction. When had she become this person? This woman who came home to silence, who spoke to no one, who had barricaded herself away from every human connection as if relationships were diseases to be quarantined against. Margaret stood abruptly, her dinner half eaten, and walked to the window. Outside, the city moved. People walked dogs, couples held hands, a father carried a child on his shoulders. Life was happening out there, messy and complicated and beautiful. And she was in here, safe and still and slowly suffocating. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass. She looked older than 47. When had those lines deepened around her mouth? When had her eyes taken on that flat, distant quality? "What are you doing?" she whispered to her reflection, and the sound of her own voice startled her. It sounded rusty, unused. The truth crashed over her then, sharp and undeniable. She hadn't been protecting herself from stress. She'd been running from being human. Yes, Karen was exhausting. Yes, family dinners were draining. Yes, other people's problems were heavy and complex and sometimes overwhelming. But that was what it meant to be alive, to be connected, to be part of the human story. She'd traded being tired for being empty, and empty was so much worse. Margaret picked up her phone with shaking hands. The family chat was discussing Tom's upcoming birthday. Rachel had sent 3 messages asking if anyone had heard from Margaret. Karen's last voicemail from 2 weeks ago had been brief. I miss you, Marg. I know I talk too much, but I miss my friend. She typed before she could overthink it. I miss you too. The response came within seconds, a heart emoji then. Call me. Margaret hit the call button. Her heart hammered as it rang once, twice. Marg! Oh my God, Marg, I was so worried. I know. Margaret interrupted gently. I'm sorry. I've been hiding. There was a pause. From what? From everything. From everyone. I thought I needed the quiet, but I just ended up alone. Karen's voice softened. You don't have to be alone. I know I'm a lot sometimes. My therapist says I process externally, which is just a fancy way of saying I talk too much, but you're not too much, Margaret said, and realised she meant it. You're just human. We all are. They talked for an hour. About Karen's daughter, yes, but also about Margaret's loneliness, about the patterns they'd both fallen into, about how hard it was to be in midlife, trying to figure out who you were when all the old certainties had dissolved. It was messy and meandering and sometimes exhausting, but it was real. Margaret could feel something thawing inside her chest, something she hadn't known was frozen. When they hung up, Margaret opened the family chat and typed, What time is Tom's birthday dinner? I'll be there. Rachel's response was immediate. Margaret, 6 p.m. Saturday. I'll make your favourite dessert. Margaret smiled at her phone, then at her reflection in the window. She still looked tired. The lines were still there. But something in her eyes had changed, some spark of life returning. The apartment was still quiet, but it felt different now, not like a fortress anymore. More like a temporary shelter, a place to rest between connections rather than a place to hide from them. She had a long way to go. She'd built these walls brick by brick, and they wouldn't come down overnight. But she'd made a start. She'd reached out her hand, and someone had taken it. That was something. That was everything. Saturday would be hard. There would be gossip and complaints and endless discussions of other people's problems. She would get tired. Her shoulders would tense, but she would be there, part of the mess, part of the family, part of the world. Because the alternative, this terrible, suffocating silence, was no way to live at all.
Late night, dog eye stamps my wrist. Green light, heard you been fucking like you know my life, but you only see my body in the strobe.